constitutive of the self and the felt life as a whole. In the novel, the search for lost time is ultimately fulfilled through the comprehensive and detailed remembering of events in the life of the first-person narrator, who is writing his life story. Time is regained through the remembered and recorded life. For Proust, too, one source of this idea is the transition between sleeping and waking. Proust's narrator recounts the experience of a short-term loss of the self that is resolved only by an influx of memories. When I awoke in the middle of the night, not knowing where I was, I could not even be sure at first who I was. I had only the most rudimentary sense of existence, such as may lurk and flicker in the depths of an animal's consciousness. I was more destitute than the cave-dweller, and then the memory, not yet of the place in which I was, but of various other places where I had lived and might now very possibly be, would come down like a rope let down from heaven to draw me up out of the abyss of not being, from which I could never have escaped by myself. In a flash I would traverse centuries of civilization, and out of a blurred glimpse of oil lamps, then of shirts with turned-down collars, would gradually piece together the original components of my ego. According to this account, the self forms out of memory. This is often described as the narrative self that creates itself from the stories we tell about ourselves. But there is also a sense of self that exists as the mere feeling of being, without autobiographical knowledge. This is minimal self, or core self, in the seconds of waking up. As the narrative self is not updating, consciousness is focused on something nevertheless. It is the physical self that is at the center of perception and thought, which enables the differentiation between the self and non-self. Under normal circumstances, we are aware of our experiences, memories, and expectations, the objects of our consciousness. Below the surface, however, we also have the minimal self, the egocentric anchor of all experiences that in the above-mentioned situation of memorylessness awakening is suddenly experienced very clearly, as the usual objects of our consciousness, perceptions, and memories are missing. I am thrown back upon myself. In such a case, the experience of self can be understood as an ego pole. My ego subject is focused on an ego object. I perceive myself. However, there is a fundamental problem here, as the ego object is categorically different from the ego subject. If we observe ourselves self-referentially, that is, the ego subject observes itself, it always observes itself as an ego object. In the philosophy of subjectivity in the 19th century, this problem brought about major bodies of thought. The impossibility of being able to perceive oneself as an ego subject was described effectively by Thomas Bernhardt in his novella Walking. If we observe ourselves, we are never observing ourselves but someone else. Thus we can never talk about self-observation, or when we talk about the fact that we observe ourselves, we are talking as someone we never are when we are not observing ourselves, and thus when we observe ourselves, we are never observing the person we intended to observe, but someone else. The concept of self-observation, and so, also, of self-description, is thus false. These experiences on waking up, the awakening of the self, can be quite extraordinary as states of consciousness. Marcel Proust describes major alterations in temporal perception. In a flash I would transverse centuries of civilization. Altered states of consciousness very often go hand in hand with an altered perception of space and time, as we shall see. Ultimately, our perception and our thoughts are organized in terms of space and time. Extraordinary states of consciousness must therefore also affect space and time. When I wake up, I look drowsily at the clock. I go back to sleep and have a very striking and complex dream full of drama, which, I feel, goes on for a long time. When I wake up again, I look at the clock to see that only 3 minutes have passed. Subjectively, in retrospect, I remember impressions that are the length of a movie. Subjective and objective time differ dramatically from one another. In the transition from sleeping to waking, we experience the boundaries of our usual state of self. Every time we wake, we become conscious of ourselves.